Good morning, everyone. I know we still have folks joining, but I'll take just a moment as we're getting close to the 9:30 hour to introduce Darren Smith, who is going to be presenting for us today on the Paid Leave for All Workers Act here in Illinois. Darren comes to us from SIKICH with a ton of experience and even more research into what this act is and how it's going to impact your agency. We will be recording this. I'll also send that information out to you after the call. And I do encourage you to use the chat or the Q&A to ask questions throughout. This is your opportunity to kind of pick the brain of somebody who's studied the new act pretty extensively. So please take advantage of that time and use those features, and we will be monitoring them throughout the presentation. So I will hand things over to Darren at exactly 9:30. So thank you, Darren, for coming and for sharing this information with us. And we look forward to what you're going to teach us today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So you can still see my screen okay before we get started?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, well, good morning. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking Stormy for allowing me to present to the group today. Some of you may recognize me that attended the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion training last September that I presented on, and it's so glad to be back with you again here this morning. Although it's on a new topic, front of mind for most of you heading into the end of the calendar year, as in January, the Illinois Paid Leave for All Workers Act will take effect January 1st, 2024. And that will be what we will be discussing today in detail. So throughout the discussion, we'll be touching on the new Illinois Paid Leave for All Workers Act. In early 2023, Illinois Governor Pritzker signed into law the Paid Leave for All Workers Act, which will require most Illinois employers to provide employees working in the state of Illinois to accrue up to 40 hours of paid leave, which can be taken for any reason, sometimes without notice, during a predetermined 12-month period. So that's just kind of the high-level overview, and we will go ahead and jump in. First of all, just an introduction. So as Stormy had said, my name is Darren Smith. I'm a consulting manager at SIKICH. We are based out of, headquartered actually in Naperville, and have a presence in basically 43 offices across the United States. So I come to you with a master's in business administration with a emphasis in human resources management. I am dual certified in human resources from both the HR Certification Institute with a PHR, and then from the Society of Human Resources Management with a Society of Human Resources Management Certified Professional certification. Throughout my nearly 20 years of continuous HR experience, I've held various positions all the way up to Vice President of Human Resources for a team of 8 other HR professionals. And my extensive experience in HR to this extent has included leadership and professional development, some of which we're doing today, organizational management, employee relations, change management, succession planning, compensation and benefits management, strategic and consultative HR, legal compliance, again, some of which we're touching on today, as well as workforce planning and development. All right, so here's exactly what we'll be covering today during our time. Again, if you have any questions, I will leave partway through. I have a question section, and then at the end, we'll definitely leave time for questions and answers if you want to write them down and save them all till the end. And is over, you can direct those to Stormy, and she can send those to me, and I'm happy to answer those after today's session as well. So today we are going to do an overview of the Paid Leave for All Workers Act. We are going to discuss who's covered employers and employees. We are going to discuss the 2 compliance options for complying with the new law. We're going to talk about carryover allowances and restrictions. We're going to discuss how employees are able to use paid leave. We're going to discuss the employee notice period and any documentation that may be required. We'll also talk about the impact of any employees that may be rehired from previously being terminated or resigned, and any transferred employees. We'll talk about enforcement under the law and penalties that could be enforced with organizations by the Illinois Department of Labor. And we will talk about how the new law correlates or contradicts with the Chicago and Cook County sick leave laws that are in place today. And then lastly, we'll discuss what, if anything, is needed to update any existing leave policies that are in place today. So as we go through, again, kind of like I announced in the preface, in March, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed SB 208, better known as the Paid Leave for All Workers Act, into law. This made Illinois only the third state in the nation to mandate paid time off for any reason, joining Nevada and Maine as the only other states to mandate such leave for employees. So the Illinois for Paid Leave Act requires most Illinois employers to provide employees with up to 40 hours of paid leave during a predetermined 12-month period. This new law goes into effect January 1st, 2024, and it is available to employees for any purpose when they choose to use it, starting March 31st or 90 days following a new employee's start date. An employee may begin using their accrued paid time off for any reason without the requirement of providing any documentation to their employer. This law applies to every employee working for an employer in Illinois, but does not include independent contractors or 1099s. And there are just a few exceptions, which we'll discuss today. So when I say it applies to any employer, that even means an employer that has one employee, right? So this law does not, it's not like Family Medical Leave Act where you have to have 50 employees working in a certain radius. This applies to everybody working in the state of Illinois that has employees in the state of Illinois. So basically, all employers in Illinois are required to follow this legislation, with the exception of school districts and park districts. So school districts organized under the school code or park districts organized under the park district code are exempt from this law as it sits today. Again, there may be some changes before the January 1st effective date, but at this point in the year, with us only having 3.5 months left, I don't envision many more changes coming down. There may be some more clarification on what we discussed today, but I will give you all the clarification that we have to date thus far. So the law does cover units of state and local government and government agencies. There is no threshold number of employees, like I said. We are going to discuss here the employees that are covered. So again, the legislation covers all Illinois employees with the few exceptions that we can see here. This means that the act covers full-time employees, part-time employees, temporary employees, other than those excluded in this list, as well as paid summer interns. So that's something to keep in mind. So employees that are exempt from this law include employees covered under the Federal Railroad Unemployment Insurance Act or Railway Labor Act, temporary college or university student employees. So those are ones working for the college or the university, not any student interns that you may hire through the summer or fall or during breaks. It also is exempt for certain short-term employees of an institution of higher learning. Employees working in construction industry covered by a bona fide collective bargaining agreement or CBA are exempt from this new law. Employees covered by a bona fide CBA whose employer provides services nationally and internationally of delivery, pickup, and transportation of parcels, documents, and freight are exempt. And then employees covered by a valid CBA in effect on or after January 1st, 2024, that explicitly waives the requirements of the act are also exempt. And you may seem like this is a pretty weird like exclusion category. So to my understanding, like with United Airlines, UPS, and those all having headquarters in the state of Illinois, that's why some of these are exempt, because they're already covered under collective bargaining agreements that are done by the Teamsters or like the pilots union and things like that. So that's why these particular industries and everything were kind of pieced out from coverage under the law. So that's the best of what I've been able to uncover so far. So now that we know who is covered by the Act and which employees you may be able to exempt from coverage, let's discuss the various ways that you can choose to provide up to the 40 hours of the mandated paid leave each year. So there are two compliance options under the Act. The first one is using an accrual method, and secondly is front loading the leave at the beginning of the benefit year. I say benefit year in this case, that is when you decide to offer the benefit, and we'll touch on that in just a little bit. So we'll walk through how each of these two methods works very briefly, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail on the next couple of slides to talk about how they function. So under the accrual method, employees earn paid leave over a period of time as work is performed and is based on total hours worked. So when we say total hours worked, that means any regular time, any overtime, okay? It does not include holidays. It does not include time off for vacation. It does not include time off under the Paid Leave Act law. It does not include time off for FMLA leave of absence. So it is only hours worked for employees, and that's how they accrue under the new law. So the specific period of time we're going to refer to as the benefit year, and most employers use a calendar year basis, which would align with the law taking place effective on January 1st, 2024. Employers could also accrue based on a fiscal year or an employee's anniversary date. However, the benefit will start to accrue on January 1st, and employees can begin taking leave as of March 31st. So real briefly, under the front loading method, employers can grant the full amount of paid leave upon hire or the first day of the benefit year, and this paid leave must all be used within the 12-month benefit year, or it will be forfeited, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Under the accrual method, there is a carryover availability for employees if they don't use any or all of the paid leave accrual that's given to them. Under the front load, if you choose to front load, there is no carryover option, and employees will forfeit any remaining paid leave allowance as of the last day of the benefit year. So, for example, if we're using the benefit year as a calendar year, as of January 1st, the following year, if you have front loaded the allowance for full-time employees, 40 hours, right? And then part-time employees may not get a full 40 hours, and we'll walk through one of those examples in a little bit. You will basically, all of that leave will have to be used by December 31st in the calendar year, or it will be forfeited on January 1st of the following year. So real quick, we're going to move to the next slide, and we're going to talk about using the accrual method and what specifically that looks like. So accrual basis under the Act, again, can begin on January 1st, 2024 for all employees that are in place on January 1st, or for any employees that you hire after January 1st, that accrual would begin on their date of hire, whichever is the later of the two in the benefit year. The accrual rate is basically, not basically, it is, the accrual rate is 1 hour of paid leave for every 40 hours worked per employee. So this accrual is not to exceed 40 hours of paid leave during the benefit year. And exempt employees under this law, so if you're salary exempt or hourly exempt, exempt employees are presumed to work 40 hours per week unless their regular work week is less than 40 hours. If you have some employees that are exempt and you may have them at 32 hours, again, keeping in mind that the accrual rate is only 1 hour of paid leave for every 40 hours worked. So if they work 32 hours in a week with no overtime, they will not accrue that 1 hour until they work 8 hours in the following week. So it's an easy implementation in an HRIS system if you get with your HR professional or with your HRIS software provider. And then hours worked are recorded where the Fair Labor Standards Act applies to all hours worked. Again, right, regular hours as well as overtime hours are included for the calculation here. And then paid leave accrues on all hours worked. Again, sorry, I'm being repetitive. I just want to make sure that we understand that. And then paid leave does not need to accrue while an employee is using the benefits of the Illinois paid leave law. So we'll touch on this point a little bit later in our discussion this morning. But I also do want to bring up like part-time employees again. So part-time employees working less than 40 hours will most likely not accrue the full 40 hours maximum of Illinois paid leave. And we'll also touch on that just a bit later in today's training. And as we move on, accrual basis under the Act continued. There is the annual accrual cap of 40 hours per benefit year. And again, benefit year for this, for ease of example, we will use as a calendar year. But again, the benefit year can be a calendar year, a fiscal year, or the employee's anniversary date. So after an employee has accrued 40 hours of paid leave in the benefit year, accrual will stop for the remainder of the benefit year. So full-time employees working 40 plus hours per week would cap sometime in the month of October. Employees working at least 31 hours a week would cap by the end of the benefit year. So anyone you have working 31, 32 hours a week would cap by the end of the year at the 40 hours. Anyone working 30 hours or less without overtime would not hit that full 40-hour cap. And again, keeping in mind that this is solely off of 1 hour of accrual for every 40 hours worked. So part-time employees working 20 hours a week won't reach that 40-hour cap. Even those working 30 to 32 hours a week will basically meet the cap at the end of the year, but they may not cap if they take vacation or PTO or some extended leave during the year. This is just something that you have to monitor internally based on the accrual. And if an individual were to go out on FMLA leave for the first 12 weeks that they're allowed, basically you could stop accrual during that time and then pick it back up once they are reinstated back into the workforce. And you would begin accruing again. And so they would not accrue for that period that they were out.
Darren, we have a couple questions that kind
Sure.
of relate to what you're discussing. The one question is, can an employer give more than 40 hours, or is it that's the minimum that has to be issued?
So an employer can choose to give more than 40 hours. So I'm not certain there's any benefit to an employer for giving more than 40 hours of the paid leave. If you have a current existing leave policy, whether it be PTO, vacation, sick, etc., we'll touch on that later in the presentation and I'll kind of explain. And I do have like a benefits of pros and cons slide of why you may want to front load or use accrual or things like that. But you can certainly give more than 40 hours of the paid leave. By this law, you do not have to go over 40 hours under the accrual or the front load.
Okay, and just to be clear, this is like leave and not like vacation time. So they
yeah, so that's where it gets a little sticky, right? Because as we'll touch on a little bit later, under the law as written today, as long as you are offering a similar, right? So same hours or greater hours of type of leave under the law, whether that be PTO, basically paid time off is almost the only one, right? Because if you have a standalone vacation policy today, you're telling employees that they can only use that for vacation. Whereas under the law, employees at their discretion are free to use this paid leave for any reason. So it does not necessarily have to be vacation. If you have a sick leave bucket, right? Then you're only telling employees that they can only use this for sick leave, which again, does not comply with the law because the employee is allowed to use this for any reason. And that's why we may want to look at maybe seeking some guidance from any external counsel or internal counsel that you may use to talk about, do we want to revamp our vacation and sick policies to just put them into one paid time off policy that meets the notification period for employees, but allows them to take the time off for any reason. That would be compliant with the law, but you would not be able to require any type of certification or documentation for why they're out.
Okay. And you said we're going to get into a few more details here in a little bit, so I won't ask any more questions about that one. The other question we have from Dawn says, what happens if an employee's time at work changes, such as a part-time employee receives 20 hours based on a standard day's hour and then becomes full-time employee? Do we then add some hours to this bucket? And what if it's the opposite? What if we front load 40 hours and then the person reduces their hours?
Yeah, that's a good question. I touch on this very briefly later. But if you front load and you do the full 40 hours and they take the full 40 hours, that is one of the risks you run, right? So if they're full-time, you front load 40 hours, they've used all of the 40-hour paid leave by July. And then on August, they go down to part-time. You can't do anything under the law as it sits today to go back and have them pay back any hours and take back that. That is one of the cons of front loading. And I touch on it again briefly, but if you do not have a lot of situations where employees are bumping back and forth between full-time and part-time, et cetera, then that wouldn't be the case. However, another one of the cons is if you have an employee that goes out on an extended leave of absence, right? And they're out for under FMLA coverage, maybe 12 weeks, maybe they're out on extended leave, which goes beyond the 12 weeks. And then again, you have a situation where they may not accrue the full 40. If you're on an accrual basis, whenever they go out on leave, you can stop the accrual. If you're on an accrual basis and they go from full-time to part-time, you can change the accrual rate at which they accrue, right? And the accrual rate would not change, but if a person goes from 40 hours a week down to 20, instead of working one full week at 40 hours to get 1 hour of paid leave, under that part-time at 20 hours a week, they would now need to work 2 full weeks to be able to accrue 1 hour of paid leave under the law.
Okay. I think those answer the questions we have for now, and I'm sure you're going to dive in even further here in just a moment.
Yeah, very good questions. And again, kind of confusing, right? Especially if you have people that are bouncing back and forth, especially if you have people that go out on an extended leave or unforeseen leave, different things like that, that you really don't attribute at the start of the year if you choose to front load. Accrual is the safer way, but you also have the carryover portion that comes with an accrual, right? So, and again, we'll touch on that in just a little bit, but very good questions. So if we go to the front loading method, which is the alternative method of the two, it's basically front loading the benefit time. Pretty self-explanatory, but this basically means that we're going to front load the entire benefit amount of paid leave at the beginning of the relevant time period. For example, again, January 1st, if you use a calendar if you use a calendar year as the benefit year, or you can use their date of hire if they're hired after January 1st, if they're a new employee, or day one of a fiscal year, if that's what you choose to do. So this would mean for full-time employees that we are granting 40 hours of paid leave on the first day of the benefit year. For all, again, full-time employees or those expected to work at least 31 hours each week, right? Because we did the example previously, by the end of the year, anyone working 31 hours or more would accrue by December 31st. But also, we would be prorating the front load of paid leave hours on the first day of the benefit year for all part-time workers, which we'll explain a little bit more in detail on the next slide. So we'll get into that a little bit, but basically, different rules apply for front loading of part-time employees as they do for full-time employees. And as we can see here, I do have an image that I've pulled directly from the law as written today. And it says, I know we touched on this a little bit earlier, right? If they currently have a policy in place, and we'll touch on it as we wrap up today. But the way the law reads today, it says employers that provide the minimum number of hours of paid leave to an employee on the first day of employment or the first day of the 12-month period are not required to carry over paid leave from the 12-month period to 12-month period, and may require employees to use all paid leave prior to the end of the benefit period or forfeit the unused paid leave, right? So front load gets away from that carryover. It depends on what your risk tolerance is here as an employer or in partnership with your legal counsel. And then accrual does allow for that carryover, but it's like a point in time type of basis where employees are only able to use what they've accrued to any point in the year. So for front loading, the key words here for part-time employees and the new paid leave law are prorated front loading and expected to accrue. A while back, we discussed that employees working for you at least 31 hours a week would eventually reach the annual cap of 40 hours sometime in December at the latest, if you use a calendar year for the benefit year. So it wouldn't be worth your efforts to attempt to front load for employees working 31 or 32 hours per week. Probably most important for your part-time employees working 20 hours or less a week would be the front loading method. When we look at employees working 20 hours, we're assuming the employee takes no time off, PTO, vacation, leave, etc. And we'll multiply this by 52 weeks in a year, which equates to 1,040 hours. Now to calculate prorated hours, we would take the 1,040 hours worked and divide the annual accrual max of 40 hours. So in other words, we take 1,040 hours and divide by 40, which would come out to 26 hours of prorated paid leave under the new law that the employee would accrue over the full benefit year by working 20 hours a week for 52 weeks. Any front load amount needs to meet or exceed that accrual. So we would need to provide at least 26 hours of Illinois paid leave on the first day of the benefit year for employees working 20 hours per week for those individuals that we choose to front load. So also keeping in mind that this law accounts for all hours worked, including overtime, we need to consider this when front loading. So case in point, like, does a part-time employee in your system actually work just 20 hours each week, or do they routinely put in 24 to 26 hours of work with some unexpected overtime, etc.? So this would cause their overall annual accrual to be more than 26 hours of paid leave based off the original 20 hours per week that they may be designated as an employee in your HRIS system. So it is also worth noting that unlike a pure front load of 40 hours of paid leave, prorated front loading for part-time employees on the first day of the benefit plan year would not result in the full 40 hours of paid leave accrual being front loaded. And therefore, for prorated front loading, this does not alleviate the carryover obligation for prorated front loading, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You knew there had to be a caveat they threw in there somewhere about front loading, and we will discuss it a little bit more. So basically this says right from the law that I highlighted in yellow on the right-hand side, an employer may make available the minimum number of hours of paid leave subject to pro rata requirements provided in subsection B to an employee on the first day of employment or the first day of the 12-month period. I know that was a lot. I'll go ahead and open up Stormy for any more questions that may be in the chat that is presented from the slide.
Yes, I can answer this one. Melissa, we will email the slides along with, Darren has created a cheat sheet, like an FAQ, shorter, kind of to the point in some of these highlights that he's talking about. So you will be getting those. Somebody mentioned something in the quote, in the chat. That says, when front loading, how do you determine the amount to give if the employee works less than 40 hours?
Right.
Example,
So
if I only work 15 hours in a week and start in April, what time should I front load for the year?
yeah. So right, we went through one of those examples, and I know I went through it a little quickly, but this middle bullet point here, I'll go through it one more time. Okay, so in this particular case, if we have an employee working 20 hours a week, we are basically going to take the 20 hours a week times 52 weeks in the year. Whether it benefit year, calendar year, fiscal year, it doesn't matter. Those are all 52 weeks because they run from one day to the next in a full 52-week cycle. If we look at an employee working 20 hours a week, again, assuming that there's no time off that our part-time employees take, we would do the 20 hours a week times 52 weeks in a year. So this gives us 1,040 hours worked. You divide that 1,040 hours worked by 40, which is the annual accrual, the annual cap under the law that is stated that has to be provided for full-time employees. So because this is part-time, we're dividing the 1,040 hours by 40 hours allowed for full-time employees under the thing. And I know we're speaking about part-time employees, but the 40 is the max for full-time employees, so we don't go over that. So then we take the 1,040 hours, we divide by 40 hours, which is the annual max, and that gives us 26 hours of prorated paid leave under this new law. Right, so you could see there, if we have a person in our system only works 20 hours, we would front load 26 hours based on the assumption that they're not taking any vacation, any leave, any extended time away from work for any reason. Again, now if they do, and they've used all of that before their time away, and we've prorated the leave and front loaded it, there's not anything we can do to get that time back if they've already used it, or that's not a benefit to front loading, right? Once you give it, it's there, it's available, they can use it. So I hope I know it's kind of, it's taking the legal portion and then you're adding some math in there, and for us, one is hard enough, right? And it's hard enough for me to explain it to try and hope that everybody understands it, but I hope that gave you a little bit more clarity on how it would work for part-time employees. So in a case where you would have an employee that only works 15 hours a week, you would take 15 times 52 weeks, and then you would get that number, you would divide that number by 40, and then that would be your new front-loaded prorated number.
Okay, we did get a couple more questions. Is the employer required to pay out any unused paid leave when an employee terms as is required of any unused vacation time? So is it paid out? Or are you going to be reviewing that a little bit later when you talk about some of the pros and cons? Because I know front loading, from what you said earlier, it's lost, but otherwise, so that's a good technical technical question to be asking.
Yeah, so we will talk about it a little bit later. So there are two things, right? And this is one of the things I didn't quite get to the point because we'll talk about it later. If you give more than the 40 hours of the leave, that original, if a person were to leave, terminated, resigned, or whatever, you may be responsible for paying anything in excess of the 40 hours that they have available. But basically, the letter of the law, as it says today, is upon separation, none of this paid Illinois leave is paid out upon separation. So if you did a separate bucket, right? I know we talked about a vacation policy earlier, and you may have 40 hours in a vacation policy that you want parameters and guardrails around, where an employee has to give 3 weeks of notice for vacation. An employee has to take it for vacation, and that, right? Now, if you did a separate bank of hours solely for the Illinois paid leave, you cannot make an employee take vacation or Illinois paid leave. It would be their choice to choose. If they were taking a vacation, they could use either one, right? So in this case, an employee technically, if they know that vacation would be paid out and the Illinois paid leave would not be paid out, and there's two separate buckets, an employee, if they were trying to work the system, and I always say, I hate to look at the worst in people, right? But I know sometimes it happens. 20 years in HR, I've seen it. An employee would take the Illinois paid leave for vacation because they can use it for any reason. And if vacation is paid out upon their termination or separation, they would get that pay, but they would not get anything set aside specifically for Illinois paid leave.
Okay. One more question.
Sure.
If we determine to front load based on a fiscal year, example, the fiscal year ends June 30th. Do they still front load 20 hours instead of 40 at January 1 and then add the remaining 20 hours at July 1st, like separate it fiscal by calendar year?
So you would need to prorate the first year, right? So if we're going into 2024, you would need to prorate the 20 hours for all full-time employees. And then on July 1st, you would need, if you're using the fiscal year as your benefit year, and if you choose to front load for all full-time employees, you would need to make the full accrual amount available on the first day of the benefit year. So it would be on July 1st, you would need to make an additional 40 hours available for all full-time employees if you're using the front loading method.
So it would be a full 40 hours, not 20 hours, and then 20 in January. It's the full 40 because you're using your benefit year of July 1st.
Yes,
So that 40 hours would count through 6 months of 23 and then 6 months of, about 6 months of 24.
yes.
Okay. Well, it looks like that was my last question. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Great questions. So here we go. So these are some of the pros and cons. So we'll talk for a minute about the benefit to employers choosing the front load, and also the pros and cons of front loading these paid leave benefits. So one of the main key benefits is front loading avoids the need for programming and accrual calculation in your HRIS or payroll timekeeping system. Another significant benefit is from the employee relations perspective. A show of trust toward your employees appears that something is being given rather than something that must be earned by the employees, right? As an employer, you're giving them the benefit up front rather than making them earn the benefit through the accrual method. Again, it's just a show of good faith. It's maybe a nice thing to show for positive employee relations for your employees, etc. So this also reduces the opportunity for employees to be on unpaid leave status early in the benefit year because they would not have a chance to accrue their paid leave time to this point in the benefit year, right? So if you did the accrual method and employees are out for an extended period at the beginning of the year, they would basically accrue nothing until they came back, worked their first 40 hours, they would accrue 1 hour. So by front loading, again, it would allow some of those individuals to get paid leave for some of their time away, to be able to use those benefits to offset being out on unpaid leave and not getting any type of benefit in that particular case. However, that front loading on the first day of the benefit year may also be a con in terms of usage, right? And I know I've talked about it a couple of times, but in certain cases, employers have to worry about time being saved and quite a few employees being off for end of year holidays and vacation. In these cases, employers may benefit from front loading, so the paid leave is available throughout most of the year rather than only when accrued by employees. An additional con of the front loading method is going to be the increased cost on employers. Granting the time up front may end up being overly generous because you assume again that all full-time employees will continue working full-time throughout the entire year, and that they won't be going out on a leave of absence, they won't be quitting, and they won't drop to a part-time schedule during the benefit year. All of which are risks that you would assume if you did the front-loading method for all of your employees. So in the end, front-loading may be a little more expensive in the long run for the sake of ease of administration, which is always a struggle we see with paid administration of any kind. Offsetting the administrative burden with tasks such as these at a slightly higher expense may be a benefit for some employees. But at the end of the day, you know your employees' population the best, and you can gauge whether front-loading or accrual of paid leave would be best for your organization in your current situation as it sits on January 1st, 2024, when you start to either front-load or begin accruals. Okay, so to this point, we've talked about what the Illinois paid leave law is. We've talked about the differences between accrual and front loading. So now we're going to dive into the carryover aspect of the Illinois paid leave law and what that looks like under both methods of both front loading and accrual. So when do we have carryover under the Illinois paid leave at the end of a benefit year? I'm sorry, so when do we have to carry over unused Illinois paid leave? With this in mind, let's agree that the simplest way for employers to comply under the Act is to front load the paid leave for all employees at the beginning of the benefit year. And for full-time employees, if you front load the full 40 hours, you alleviate the need for carryover of any unused time from the previous year. So let's just say all full-time employees, January 1st, 2024, you give them 40 hours. Full-time, it's not prorated. They're getting the full 40 hours allowed under the law. They have to use all of that time in the benefit year, in this case, again, calendar year. They have to use all that by December 31st, or they will lose any carryover into the next plan year. But with the carryover in mind, if an employer doesn't want to front load all 40 of those hours for employees at the beginning of the year, they do have a few options. They can prorate the front load for part-time employees, or they can choose to opt for the accrual method, both of which will require a carryover option into the next benefit year. So if the 40-hour accrual is prorated for all part-time workers, they must be allowed to carry over all unused paid leave from one benefit year to the next. Similarly, employers that opt for the accrual method must allow carryover of all unused accrued paid leave hours from one benefit year to the next. Now, this could get a little sticky because, for example, an employee that accrues 40 hours of paid leave in year one and doesn't use any of the paid leave in accordance with this act must, by law, be permitted to carry over all 40 hours of accrued paid leave into year 2. So we will say 2024, they don't use any of the 40 hours, and they accrue them. They'll be allowed to carry over all 40 hours into 2025. And then they're able to accrue another 40 hours in year 2, in this case, 2025. So that same employee would then accrue paid leave hours in year 2. And for example, if no paid leave hours are used again in year 2, that same employee would be permitted to carry over all 80 hours of accrued unused paid leave from year 2 into year 3. So they'd be carrying over 40 from year 1, 40 from year 2, if no leave under this law is used. So on the next few slides, we will discuss several topics on the use of leave and whether an employee can use an entire bank of more than 40 hours in a benefit year. I know that there will be questions. Let's get through the next 1 or 2 slides because it will answer some of those questions. And then if there are still questions at that point, we can go from there. So using Illinois paid leave for employees, putting your fears to rest, right off the bat, I will tell you that employees are limited to using no more than 40 hours of paid leave within a given benefit year, no matter their accrual allotment from carryover hours. So if you have the last instance on the last slide, where we said an employee would be able to carry over 40, accrue another 40, and be able to carry over 80, under the law, they are only allowed to use 40 hours of paid leave in a benefit year. So employees can begin using the Illinois paid leave on their 90th day of employment with the company, or beginning on March 31st, 2024 for existing employees, whichever is later. So when the law goes into effect on January 1st, 2024, all employees will start accruing or be entitled to front load amount of paid leave hours. But they're not eligible to take the paid leave until March 31st, which gives employers roughly a 3-month grace period to ensure everything is in place in regards to compliance under the new Illinois Paid Leave for All Workers Act. So for what reasons can employees use the time? The simple answer is they can use it for any reason. This time can be used for vacation, for a mental health day, for a sick day for themselves or a sick family member, etc., and a myriad of number of other reasons. They don't need to give a reason for using the leave, and in most cases, they don't need to give any advance notice, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There are currently no limitations within the law on the reason that employees may use leave. So when we look at this, the 4th bullet point, employers are able to set a minimum increment of use at no less than 2 hours of paid leave time in one instance. So you can put it in your payroll timekeeping system. You can put it in your HRIS system that you cannot put it, they have to take all 8 hours, right, at a time. The minimum increment that you can put in the system is 2 hours. So you can't require them to use 4 hours at a time, and vice versa. They cannot be late like 15 minutes or an hour and say, oh, I'm using this towards, the paid leave under the law. It has to be 2 hours. So again, can't use 15 minutes or 30 minutes to cover tardies or anything like that, unless you as the employer allow it, but there is no requirement to do so. I know some managers always make exceptions, but it should be specified that if when the new law is implemented, this is how we will follow it. This is what our policy will state, and anything like that. If anybody does need any help at this point with updating their vacation or their sick or just like one PTO policy, first I would advise to seek your legal counsel, like internal or external, talk about the best way to do it. Do you keep the current policy in place and just add a second policy around Illinois paid leave law? Or do you combine them into one paid time off bucket and the employees can use for any reason? So those are some things to keep in mind. So additionally, employers cannot mandate that employees take paid leave to find a replacement or to also find someone to cover their time away as a condition of the paid leave. So you're not allowed to force them to find a backup or someone to take their spot in the manufacturing line or things like that. Under the law, you're not allowed to do that. And these people can take paid leave without that happening. So lastly, as noted here, employees will receive their straight time hourly rate of pay for any paid leave taken under the Act, which does not include commissions or gratuities for employees that are eligible for those. Ensuring, of course, that the hourly rate cannot drop below the applicable minimum wage. So to this point, pay topics such as shift differentials and the like have not been determined under the Act. So we're hoping to get more clarity as the January 1st effective date approaches. But to this point, there is no clarity around the shift differentials or things like that. Right now, as it states, they will be paid their regular rate of pay when out for leave under this Act. Before we move to the next slide about notice and documentation, are there any questions?
There is one clarifying question in the chat. If the current paid leave procedure for full-time employees gives more than the minimum amount required, we do not need to change the procedures. We only need to address the new procedure for our part-time employees.
Yes and no. Okay, so if the current PTO, whatever, if your current leave policy meets the minimum or exceeds, right? It also has to comply with the fact that employees are able to take that for any reason. You cannot require documentation for the absence, and which we'll talk about on the next slide. For foreseeable instances, employees are required to give 7 days advance notice, and that's it. So if your PTO or time off policy today states employees must give 3 weeks notice, 4 weeks notice, that would need to be revised to only the 7 days. And in some cases, if it's an unforeseeable absence, they need to give no prior notice at all. So
I have a real quick, when you say no prior notice, like they just cannot show up to work, or they can just, okay.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that next, right?
Okay.
So if it's an unforeseeable instance, right? And again, it will be hard to monitor because we cannot ask for documentation. We cannot ask for certification. They can just say, I just got in a car accident. I'm going to the doctor. Okay, well, give us a copy of the police report or the doctor's note, right? They're like, you can't do that under this law. Again, it's for any reason. If it's unforeseeable, they don't need to give any prior notice. And this is where it's really heavily benefited to the employee side, where the employer has little to no abilities under this to require any type of proof.
Well, I mean, outside of proof though, if, you know, I just didn't show up to work today and I come in the next day and I say, oh, well, it was unforeseeable that I was sick yesterday. I technically did not have to call them prior to coming to work.
Yeah, so again,
like they can't write something that says, like, can you call
again,
off?
Yeah, so again, saying the day after you didn't show up, oh, I want to use paid leave, right? It gets a little dicey. I would say that would not fly. However, if your shift starts at 9 a.m. and you call at 8:59 or 9 a.m. and you say, hey, I got in an accident, or I have a sick kid, or something or other, I won't be able to make it in time for my shift today. I actually won't be in at all today. They notified you on the day of that they're taking Illinois paid leave under the protections of the Act. And as an employer, there's no repercussions for that employee.
So on the day of, but does not protect no call, no show situations.
The law does not stipulate, but I would say as an employer, I would definitely make sure that you stipulate that in any policy, right? It would almost be the same case today, right? If you have a vacation policy in place today, your employee misses completely today, no call, no show. They contact you tomorrow and say, oh yeah, I want to take yesterday as a vacation day. Got to make sure you have it covered in the policy, right? But if they miss a day, they cannot go back and say, I want yesterday to be paid leave under the Protected Act, because the act doesn't state that that is permissible by employees in this case.
It's not proactive or post-active, I guess. Okay, that's great. Somebody else added,
The Governor's Bereavement Act says that we are able to not pay employees for bereavement leave. But if I understand this, they can use this leave for bereavement and we must pay them, correct?
They can use it for any reason and they are to be paid under the act, if yes.
And they don't have to tell you the reason why at all. Like, I'm just using a leave day tomorrow.
Yeah,
Or
and you
today.
cannot, and they cannot require a death certificate, right? I know some employers go as far as, okay, you want to take 3 days off for bereavement. We just need a copy of the death certificate or like the service notification that you attended the funeral or whatever, and then you get the time off. Under this, if they're just saying, hey, I'm taking the next 3 days off, don't need to tell you a reason, they get the time as long as they've accrued it. Or if you front loaded it and it's available, they can use it without any reason.
Okay. Few questions that came up in the Q&A. Just to clarify, if they have set vacation, sick, and personal time, this 40 hours is in addition to those hours. And I think we're getting ready to cover some of that question here in a moment, right?
Yeah, so if you have
Okay.
a current policy today, like I said, if you have a current vacation policy that states it's only for vacation use, does not comply with this law. If you have a separate sick policy that it can only be used for sick, does not comply with this law. If you wanted to keep those two policies in place and permit it for only those reasons, you would have to add a third policy for Illinois Paid Leave for All Workers Act policy that states they have an additional 40 hours for full-time employees, whether accrued or front-loaded, or the prorated for part-time employees. You would have to include carryover. You would have to include no notice is needed. You would have to include no documentation is required, things like that.
Okay. So in some ways we're hearing that like PTO might be a strong way to go if you wanted to include it in one bucket, just making sure that we add those clarifiers to PTO as well, as far as no notice and all of those things.
So yeah.
Clarity, right?
So I would advise seeking legal counsel. Whether
Perfect.
it's
Okay.
internal or external, the normal route you would go. If I was sitting in the chair and it was tasked with me for making a decision here, I would put it into one bucket, all for paid time off. I would say employees could take it for any reason. I would say in foreseen instances, 7 days advance notice is required. In unforeseen instances, as soon as possible. Sometimes it would be day of, sometimes it would be right before shift starts, right? I would also put in there that as an employer, we cannot require documentation. You don't necessarily need to put that in there, but it could be the unwritten rule. You cannot ask for that under the law. And then also you would have to stipulate any type of carryover if you're choosing the accrual method or you're front loading at a prorated rate for less than full-time employees.
Okay. Somebody asked where in the new law is the calculation specifically. They're asking because the current policy for 40-hour people, they receive 24 hours. 20-hour people receive 12 hours. It looks like part-time employees will receive more than a week off, while full-time employees receive only a week off. Seems slanted to favor people that work less hours.
So again, no, part-time employees, if you're front loading, you only prorate for hours worked, right? Or anticipated to work. If you have a part-time employee and they're only working 20 hours a week, they would only get 26 hours total of prorated front load leave for the year. So that's literally only 3 days, 3 full days plus 2 additional hours. Whereas full-time employees working 31 or more hours under this example would be getting 5 full days at 8-hour days of leave.
Okay, somebody asked why not 20 hours then instead of 24 hours?
Why not 20 hours of front loaded?
Front loaded because they're part-time, because it's a 1 week, right? They only work 20 hours. Would, if they only work 20 hours, why would they get 24 hours then?
So here is a part of the equation where you make the determination as the employer. The things that stay constant are the 52 weeks in a year. The things that are variable are the number of hours worked in a week, and then the number of total hours anticipated for a year, right? So if you have a 20-hour employee, you fill in that blank with 20 hours, you multiply it times the 52, you get that number like we discussed earlier as 1,040. You divide that 1,040 by another fixed variable, which is 40 hours, which is the cap under the law as stated today. So the ones that are fixed are the 52 weeks, and it's the 40-hour maximum cap that you use to divide a part-time employee's anticipated full hours worked in a 52-week year. I can try and put when I'll send you out. When I send you out my summary, I will put a nice little type of equation at the bottom to use for part-time employees if you're choosing to front load, right? So it'll just basically be open. That's a variable item would be the number of hours in a week, right? The fixed is the 52 weeks. The variable is going to be the total, right, of those hours times 52 weeks, and then another fixed. I'll put an equation in the document that I send you out that will really help clarify this for people, where all they have to do is input the expected number of hours, and then it will give them what they need to front load. And it may not be 26, it may be 20, it may be 14, it may be 10. If a person only works 5 hours a week and they're part-time, they're still covered under the act, but they may only get like 2 hours, 4 hours of paid leave for the year under this act.
Okay. In the example you gave, though, would it be fair to say the reason it's 24 hours, even though you only work 20 hours, is because a full-time employee can also be considered 31 hours, and they're still going to get 40 hours. They're getting 9 hours over what their full-time hours are typically.
So
or that's always going to vary. It's
so easiest way that I can explain this. Can you see my calculator?
Yep.
Okay. So remember we talked about for all full-time employees working 40 hours, they actually cap sometime in October. So they don't accrue anything else in the rest of October, the rest of November, the rest of December. Once they've hit that 40 hours, they're done accruing. There is no more accrual. So if you have an employee that works, let's say, okay, 32 hours, right? Times 52 weeks in a year is 1,664 anticipated hours for that employee. Okay, you divide that by 40. 41.6 hours is what they would accrue over the course of a full 52-week benefit year. But the cap here is 40. So an employee working 32 hours every week, if there was no accrual, I'm sorry, if there was no cap, would technically get 41.6 hours. But because there is a cap, this employee only gets 40 hours. If you have an employee working 15 hours a week, you multiply that times 52 weeks in a year, 780 hours anticipated that that person would work in the full year. You divide that by the 40-hour accrual cap max under the law, 19 and a half hours. So that's what a 20-hour a week part-time person, I'm sorry, we did 15 hours. 15-hour a week part-time person would be prorated front load of 19 and a half hours of Illinois paid leave under this method. Does that help?
I think it does some. Is there a place inside of the new law where they can find that calculation?
There's not, but I will put it in the handout that I send to you that has a summary of bullet points of the whole entire law written in it. I will put an equation at the end that shows you where to input for part-time employees, their number of hours each week, and then how to get to what their front-loaded amount should be.
So the methods you're using are standard HR procedures for accrual and front loading leave? Since
No.
since it's not in the, not manual, I apologize, since it's not in the law?
No, so this is understanding that the cap under this law is 40 hours. So,
Okay.
So those are the fixed variables, right? An employee cannot work more than 52 weeks in a year because there's only 52 weeks. An employee cannot accrue or they can be front loaded. You can give more than the 40 hours, right? But that's beyond what the law states you have to give. So anything beyond that is up to you and your discretion, not advisable. Again, seek legal counsel, etc. But we're going by what we do know, 52 weeks in a year and a cap of no more than 40 hours. Everything else would be variable based on how many hours an employee works, which would determine their front-loaded prorated amount of leave.
Okay. We have a few more questions.
Sure.
Okay. If they don't separate this, what we're speaking about today, from current vacation sick policies, do we have to give them additional time off as well?
You would need a separate policy that specifically states Illinois Paid Leave for All Workers Act, what the law states, what their entitlement of benefit is under the law, and what your requirements as an employer are, right? Cannot ask for documentation. Employees can take the leave for any reason. You cannot, employees cannot use this for less than 2 hours. And then in foreseeable instances of absence, 7 days advance notice is required. In unforeseeable instances, no advance notice is required. So as soon as practicable.
There's a statement slash question that was like, in essence, we penalize long-term employees by taking away 4 weeks of paid vacation if we put it all in one bucket of PTO.
I don't know. So I don't know what a policy reads today, right? Some policies may be more generous. I do work with some employers that only give employees possibly in their first year, like 20 hours of vacation or PTO or whatever. So this would be above that. What the law is doing is it is setting the minimum hours of leave in a benefit year at 40 for full-time employees.
So if a full-time employee had 4 weeks of paid vacation and that turned into PTO, they could maintain their 4 weeks of PTO with the new policy updates, and it would be compliant with the law and still have 4 weeks of leave protected kind of the same way.
Yeah, so anything that
doesn't reduce what employees, like say you have a long-term employee or you are more generous with your PTO slash vacation slash whatever policy, you can still be that generous you don't have to take anything away from established employees.
Yes.
You just have to make sure that the policy includes all of the disclaimers that you've given us and addresses and still is within that minimum of 40 hours. So if you have somebody who starts tomorrow, in 90 days, they're only working 15 hours every week, and you typically wouldn't give them anything, or you would give them X amount of hours, it's not going to be sufficient for the law. So really, it's a big impact on, depending on where your policy is, but you don't have to reduce what you're giving people.
Yeah.
That's going to be terrible for morale and for a million other reasons. And it's not meant to penalize, it's meant to protect shorter term employees who have to wait. Some policies that were in existence prior may have said, hey, you got to wait 5 years before you get 5 days of vacation. And so it kind of eliminates that from happening and protects employees in that way.
Yes.
Okay. If personal time is already given. Personal time is already given. Is this the same as any time leave? We're given 16 hours already. Would this need to be increased to 40? We're not asked to document any use of this time. I think that goes back to those specific policies inside of that agency, right? So they're anytime, if they call it anytime leave, they may have to make some adjustments, but it's something that they should seek legal counsel. On their specific policies, right?
Yeah, so again, if you have a personal time for any reason, and that only gives 16 hours, and you have a separate standalone vacation policy, in order to comply with this law, you would either need to combine those policies that states an employee would get a minimum of 40 hours for full-time employees, does not have to give a reason, does not have to give notice, and basically whether they accrue or are front-loaded with the benefit and what the carryover option is. If you leave them separate, you would have your vacation policy that is just for vacation. You would have to increase the personal time policy to 40 hours or keep it at 16 and then have a separate third standalone policy that gives them an additional 24 hours, right, under Illinois paid leave. So they can combine the 24 hours of the paid leave and the 16 hours of personal under the two separate policies that gives them the minimum 40 hours for full-time employees.
Okay. We do have quite a few more questions, but I feel like we're only on slide 13 and we have a handful more to go through. So let's keep going through your presentation and I will work on getting all of these questions together in one space. And then maybe we answer these questions after, depending on how much time allows for.
Okay. Yeah, I know we've gone into a lot of detail, so I'll try and get through the other slides, keeping in mind that maybe we have 18 minutes left to put us at 2 hours. So with that said, again, employee notice and documentation. If leave is foreseeable, employees must provide 7 calendar days notice in foreseeable instances. If leave is unforeseeable, employee must provide as much advance notice as practicable, and maybe no prior notice in some instances. For a policy, an employer that requires advance notice for unforeseeable absences must adopt a written policy that contains procedures for the employee to provide notice. And as in terms of documentation, employers may not require documentation or certification to support an employee's need for leave. So the 4 things that are touched on, I know we've talked about some of them in extent to this point. Right now, as written, the act doesn't have a lot of employer-friendly nuances for these scenarios. So we're hoping to get more clarity before the law goes into effect on January 1st. But if we do not, this is the way it sits today. So if you plan to require any type of advance notice for unforeseeable absences, calling off a certain number of hours before a shift, or call or text supervisor, enter the leave request in an HRIS system, you will need to have a written policy that contains procedures that spells out how employees are required to provide that notice. Generally speaking, as employers, we won't be able to require documentation or certification, even if abusive time is suspected and an employee used leave time for vacation when they told you it was for a sick family member. You cannot require a doctor's note. However, for other federal leave laws such as FMLA, you may be able to request documentation if you feel a leave qualifies as such for FMLA, etc. So as we jump into employer responsibilities, these are the three main highlights. A required workplace poster from the Illinois Department of Labor, which must be posted like most other legal posters in a conspicuous place within your premises. If your workforce consists of a significant portion of remote workers, or if your workforce consists of a significant portion of non-English speaking employees, you will be required to post the mandated poster in that other language as well. So no guidance has been given to this point in the case where you have a significant portion of remote employees, but the guidance that I can give is, like myself, I work 100% remote. My company has an intranet that they post the handbook on, updated policies on, etc. That's one place. I would also recommend emailing it to all remote employees so you have a trail that shows it was delivered. Anything like that, or an email that states this is the policy. You can find it on the intranet, etc. So again, we're hoping to get more clarity as well as where organizations may have a majority of workers remote and not physically inside of a building, but for right now, we don't have that. So in addition to putting the workplace poster in place, employers will also need to create a document or a policy and inclusion in an employee handbook if one is in place today. And then finally, there are numerous record-keeping obligations under the new law. Employers must maintain accurate records for each employee showing an employee's hours worked, employees accrued and used paid leaves, and employees' point in time remaining paid leave balances. However, keeping in mind that the law we've already discussed assumes that exempt employees work 40 hours a week, you do not have to have them start punching the clock to show that they would actually accrue, that they actually work enough time for the full 40 hours. You would just either accrue at a 40-hour annual rate, or you would front load the full 40 hours to employees. So for record keeping requirements, you must track employee hours worked, paid leave that's taken and also accrued, and upon request, provide employees with their current point in time leave balance. So payout upon separation, I know this came up earlier. Employers do not need to pay out unused time from a separate Illinois paid leave bank, okay? Like it says, from a separate paid leave bank. If you have a current PTO policy that takes into account this leave, you would pay out whatever that balance was. If you have a separate standalone Illinois paid leave policy that has a separate bank of hours, you do not need to pay that out in terms of separation. If a more generous PTO bank is used to comply with the law, employers will be required to pay out all accrued hours at separation, including any portion of the accrued bank that accounts for Illinois paid leave. And again, this is a snippet directly from the law. You'll get a copy of this. This is based on the language of the law as it's written today. So for promised and earned but unpaid vacation time or paid time off, that will be nothing in the act construes to waive or otherwise limit an employee's right to final compensation if it's all in one bank and they're not separated. Okay. So employees that have been previously separated or terminated and then are rehired again within 12 months of the termination date any unused portion of Illinois paid leave that was accrued must be reinstated up to the date of termination and made available for use immediately upon rehire, assuming that Illinois paid leave was not previously paid out upon separation from employment, but this is not specifically addressed within the act, right? So if you paid out, if you only have one PTO bank, you've paid out all accrued PTO when an employee leaves, and that bank included the time you're using for the Illinois Paid Leave for All Workers Act, you do not need to give them back any time. They would just start accruing or be front loaded at the time of rehire. If an employee is transferred to a different location, division, or department or entity, they will retain all accrued unused Illinois paid leave. So for the instance where for specific employees transferred outside of the state of Illinois, so are no longer working in Illinois within a benefit year, they will retain any accrued leave up to that point of the transfer date, but they will no longer continue to accrue leave for the portion of the benefit year they work outside of the state of Illinois. So under the Act, there are 3 types of penalties identified for employer violations today: employee damages, equitable relief, and civil penalties for employers. Damages available to affected employees for a violation of the Act include actual underpayment, compensatory damages, as well as $500 to $1,000 in penalties per violation. Equitable relief available to affected employees includes attorney's fees, reasonable expert witness fees, as well as other costs of the action that was an expense of the affected employee. And then finally, civil penalties to the employer include a $2,500 fine for each separate offense, a $500 civil penalty for each notice or posting violation, and a $1,000 penalty for each subsequent audit violation. So in our agenda preview, we highlighted that we would also discuss how the new Illinois Paid Leave Act would overlap with Chicago and Cook County's paid sick leave laws, both of which have been in effect since basically July of 2017. And then we're going to cover all employees working at that, these 2 sick leave laws cover, for the Chicago sick leave law covers all employees working within the Chicago area, as well as suburban Cook County for those employees. As we examine the chart, we see some similarities as well as some differences between the new state law and the 2 ordinances. So as you can see, accrual rate is the same for each. It's 1 hour of leave for every 40 hours worked. The accrual cap for all of these is 40 hours. The carryover under the Illinois paid sick leave law is 40 hours for employees if you don't front load for full-time employees. Under the Chicago and Cook County's paid sick leave laws for non-FMLA covered employers, 20 hours is the carryover maximum. For employers covered under FMLA, the 60 hours is the carryover maximum that employees are allowed to carry over under the Chicago and Cook County sick leave laws. Minimum increments under the Illinois paid sick law. It should not say paid sick. I'll correct that, Stormy, sorry. Under the Illinois paid leave law, minimum increment is 2 hours, 4 hours for the Chicago and Cook County paid sick leave laws. Reasons for use under the Illinois paid leave law, any reason whatsoever. However, the difference with the Chicago and Cook County paid sick leave laws is these can only be used in instances of an employee illness or family illness or injury, a business or a school closure, a result of domestic violence, or for FMLA qualified reasons. The advance notice period Under the Illinois paid leave law, 7 days foreseeable or as soon as practicable if unforeseeable. And then 7 days foreseeable and no later than same day for foreseeable. Documentation or certification is not permitted by employers under the Illinois paid leave law. Under the Chicago and Cook County paid sick leave laws, it's permitted when an employee's been gone for 3 or more consecutive days. So some, if not all of you, may have existing paid time off benefits, whether it's a single PTO bank for a combined vacation and sick leave allotment. Many initial questions wanted clarification, obviously, like we've talked about today, on whether an additional amount of time was going to need to be given to employees under the new law. So the good news is that you probably won't have to change what you are providing today, so long as what you provide satisfies the minimum amount of leave required under the law. At the employee's discretion, they get to take the leave and to take the paid leave for any reason. So case in point, a single PTO allotment that can be used for sick, vacation, mental health, etc., would satisfy the requirements so long as the leave is at the employee's discretion and meets the minimum requirements for 40 hours for full-time and then a prorated amount for part-time employees. Additional tweaking of a policy may be needed, however, for compliance with other portions of the law, such as the carryover or notice requirements. Again, as stated numerous times, it's recommended that you seek out your legal counsel, whether you should follow the legal guidance of the Act verbatim, or you having to make tweaks or changes for some of the other requirements and add that to your existing policy. And that actually takes us to our Q&A. And if we're keeping to 2 hours, we have 4 minutes left, but I'm happy to go a couple minutes over if it's really important.
Okay. If you have any more questions, please make sure to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I will add them to a list for anything that we don't get answered in the next couple of minutes. And if you don't get to put it in the chat or something pops up, please just shoot me an email, and I will get that over to try to get some more clarity from Darren. One thing that popped up in the Q&A that has not been answered yet, or needs additional clarification is any reason as in there does not mean any time you want. Can't the employer still require a time threshold for call-ins?
So yes, but that needs to be specified in the policy. I know we touched on that very briefly, probably on one of the last slides when I was trying to skip through, right? Right here, right? So an employer that requires advance notice for unforeseeable absences must adopt a written policy that contains procedures for the employee to provide notice, right? And I went into just a little bit of an example, right? Calling off a certain number of hours before the shift, call or text their supervisor, or enter leave requests in an HRIS system within 30 minutes before the start of their shift, right? But that needs to be specifically written and documented in the policy that that's the reporting under the policy for employees for this leave.
So not just like a manager's preference, something that's actually in policy is advised.
Yeah, so if you have one manager that says, I don't need to know anything, or another manager that says, I need it an hour before, then it can be seen as possibly like discriminatory, right? One employee could say, well, that person's manager didn't make them put anything in at all. My manager is telling me I have to do it an hour before. What is the actual requirement that I need to follow, right? So that's why it should be spelled out in the policy, written down and provided to employees so they're aware of exactly what the agency requirements are.
Okay. I think we have time for one more. So just for final clarification, only the 40 hours under the act would be limited with the limitation stated, but the other accrued leave does not have to be.
So yes and no. So if you're putting in just one policy, right? Let's say for ease of administration, I'm giving full-time employees 120 hours and I only have one policy. The policy has to comply with the requirements of the leave law, which is employees can take it for any reason. Employees employers cannot require documentation or certification. Employees must provide 7 calendar days notice in foreseeable instances or as soon as practicable and unforeseeable, which in some cases we know may be the day of or immediately following the start of a shift. You cannot say in one policy, your first 40 hours you could take for whatever reason, right? Anything over 40 hours, you need to take it as vacation, because then you're dictating that the first 40 hours they have to take as leave under this law, which you're not allowed to dictate. So if you wanted to dictate exactly, and you cannot say you have to take Illinois paid leave before you take any vacation. You cannot require that either. If you wanted to make a requirement, you would have to do the 2 separate policies, but you cannot tell an employee which one has to be used first.
Okay. We are actually over by a minute, but if anybody doesn't mind, there is one more question that was asked. Are they to exclude paid holiday hours and other paid types of leave hours when calculating actual hours worked for purposes of the Illinois?
Yeah, so again, it's only for hours worked, which includes regular hours and any overtime hours. Any time taken off for leave, even under this act, does not need to accrue, right? Any time taken for holidays, any time taken for business closures, right? My organization is closed between Christmas Eve and New Year's Day. People don't accrue for that time. Only actual hours worked need to be accounted for, and that's regular hours plus any overtime hours.
Okay. Okay. I think we only have one question left, if you don't mind answering, or would you like me to
Sure.
email?
No, that's fine.
So if they've already provided 9 days of personal leave a year, are they required to provide 40 hours extra? And that would be dependent on the way that you wrote the policy, right?
Yes. So if they're allowed to take personal leave for any reason, you cannot require documentation. They, in foreseeable instances, the maximum number of days they have to give is only 7. In unforeseeable instances, it's as soon as possible, right? And they don't need to give a reason, then they really don't need to change what's in place today.
Okay. As stated before, this webinar has been recorded, and I want to thank you, Darren, for answering all of our questions. We went all the way up to our allotted time today. But thank you all for participating and for asking all of those questions. I know as you let the information sink in, you might have additional questions. Please send them our way, and we will continue to assist in any way that we can. We do have some time before the act goes into effect. So again, take some time to review the materials that are coming your way, and feel free to ask questions as they kind of pop up. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a great day. And Darren, thank you so much for providing so much information to all of us. We're definitely feel a lot clearer on some of those nuances inside of that. So
yeah,
thank you.
Of course. Again, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure. And I've updated the 2 slides that had typos. I will get a fresh copy over to you. I will get a summary of the law that I've put together previously, and I will include an equation example at the bottom of that for people to use for front loading for part-time employees.
Perfect. Thank you so much. As you exit, there is a survey that should pop up. We do ask that you do complete that. So thank you guys so much, and you guys have a great day.
Thank you.